Welcome to Invested in Climate. Protecting the planet and decarbonizing the global economy is the challenge of our time. We all have a role to play, and the opportunity we face is unprecedented. Invested in Climate aims to help people do more to address climate change through their work, investments, lifestyle, and activism. I'm your host, Jason Rissman. I support a growing community of top climate and ESG leaders as the Chief Experience Officer at NationsWell, and I'm an advisor to the climate practice at IDEO. I'm also an investor and startup advisor, and when it comes to climate action, I know I'll be a lifelong learner, always looking to have more impact. If you like what you hear, give us a good rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you found us. Sign up for updates and suggest ideas for future episodes at investedinclimate.com. Follow us on social, subscribe, and spread the word. Thanks for joining.
If you look at 5 years ago, there was not a single institutional investor, not a single one in the United States, that had set a net zero plan. Today, it's investors representing tens of trillions of dollars. Not a single insurer had filed climate disclosure plans. Now, over 80% of them have. And fundamentally, there are so many companies that are doing so many examples of great leadership. But this problem of the climate risk has been going on for decades. And so it's not easy to solve. Journalist and writer H.L. Mencken once said, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer that's always wrong. So this is multifaceted, but I am an incurable optimist.
Hey everyone. After 2 years of waiting, the SEC finally came out with its new climate disclosure rules. As expected, it was met with a mix of celebration, disappointment, criticism, and lawsuits. The suits came from those who felt the rules go too far, and from those who felt they didn't go far enough. Disclosure rules are critical to ensuring companies are taking climate change seriously. They ensure investors can consider a company's climate risks as well as their progress in cutting emissions. Beyond the SEC, rules in Europe and California are also influencing corporate action in profound ways. To understand what's been happening and what's likely to happen next, I caught up with Stephen Rothstein. Stephen is the managing director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. He's been working for years to align financial markets to climate goals and is a well-respected expert on this topic. We talked about the history of disclosures, why they matter, the recent SEC rule change, the reaction it sparked, what's coming next, and much more. I always learn a lot from talking to Stephen, and I'm sure you will too. Enjoy. Hello, Stephen. Welcome back to the podcast. Great seeing you at GreenBiz and great to see you again here.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate all that you do and appreciate this time today as well.
Well, likewise, appreciate what you're doing for sure. We spoke about a year ago and learned about the work that you're doing. Let's remind our listeners, though, and really give them a sense of the role that you play as managing director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets.
Sure. So the Ceres Accelerator is part of Ceres. Ceres is a nonprofit, been around. This is our 35th year. I have a few hundred employees, and we work with large investment firms, companies, regulatory work, and policy. The accelerator itself, we focus on the financial sector. So banks, insurance, investments, the accounting sector, trying to get them to move to become more sustainable on individual and voluntary basis. And then we also work with all of their regulators from the SEC and state banking and insurance commissioners and so many more.
Great. And so not an accelerator in the sense that a lot use that term in terms of accelerating individual companies, but really accelerating a transformation of capital markets.
Exactly. We don't work with small companies that accelerate. There are a lot of great accelerators do that. We want to accelerate the pace of change. And one thing that every company, whether you're in the cement industry or the restaurant industry or real estate or anything else, is every company needs investors, every company needs banks, and every company needs insurance. And the more that those are sending market signals about climate risk and water risk, the faster the change will be.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to talk today about the recent SEC rule change. Let's start, though, by giving folks an overview of the regulatory landscape and really why it matters. Some companies have been reporting on their environmental impact for many years, others not so much. Give us a sense of the history of reporting prior to any formal regulatory requirements, what motivated that reporting, and what it led to.
Sure. So the Securities and Exchange Commission was set up 91 years ago, really as a disclosure agency. To really get to have a robust capital market, we have to have investors feel comfortable. And investors have been saying, literally for a few decades, that they want more information about climate risk. They fundamentally say that climate risk is financial risk and financial risk is climate risk. And because again, they're investing not just for the next quarter, but the next quarter century, and understanding where the plants are, where there'll be physical risks, fires, floods, tornadoes, what's happening in droughts, what's happening in that industry, transition risk. So our first meeting actually was with the SEC was in 2003, over 20 years ago. Obviously, in the last several years, climate risk has grown. I won't spend a lot of time on that. You and your listeners know that so well. The number of, unfortunately, fires, floods, tornadoes, and other things have grown dramatically. So at the same time, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of companies that have been voluntarily disclosing. For example, 92% of the Fortune 500 companies voluntarily disclose their climate information. But it's a little bit of a climate Tower of Babel, Jason, where they're using different terms, different methodologies. So this is trying to give order and similarity. At the same time, internationally, there have been requirements now. There are many other countries that are ahead of us. So the purpose of the SEC rule and a few others, California disclosure law and others, is to ensure that the market has good information. It's not to make decisions of what you should do as a company, but the theory is if the market has good information, then the market will respond, whether it's investors, clients, customers, employees.
Well, let's double click and hear about what's been happening elsewhere. As you mentioned, there's been reporting requirements in Europe and in California and other places. Let's continue hearing about the history of reporting and hear a bit about those.
There are some countries that have been doing this for many years. France, for example, started in 2016 and others. And then as of a few years ago, there were 8 countries that had some kind of mandatory climate disclosure. And then more recently, there is a group, the International Sustainability Standards Board, that was established, and they have come out with model regulations that now 15 countries are in the various stages of adopting. Some have approved it, some are going through their country process all over the world, from Asia and Europe and Canada and Latin America. There's also a stronger set of rules in Europe that goes a lot further, and I can talk about that as well. So in many countries now, in many of the capital markets, they already require disclosure. Some have already started to collect information. Some will be starting next year. So that's even before the SEC. So if you're a large company that is a multilateral and have offices or sales or in other places, you're either already required or already going to be required. I go to conferences all the time where people say by the time the SEC regulations have to be implemented, that they already will have been reporting for 1 to 2 to 3 years.
Great. Well, let's go deeper into that and definitely spending a lot of time talking to chief sustainability officers. CSRD, as well as the newly enacted California regulation, is very much on their minds and very much part of their day jobs. So let's go deeper and understand what are the main things required by CSRD, as well as the new California law.
CSRD in Europe goes further in a number of ways. First, it has what's called double materiality, meaning in the US, the issue is what impact does changing climate have on the company? So if you're an investor in the company, will the fact that there's fires or floods or transition to a new industry affect the company's stability, profitability, growth, things like that? Double materiality is also what impact does a company have by making its widget or product have on climate. So it's both climate's impact on company and company's impact on climate. The other thing CSRD goes is much smaller companies. There are about 49,000 companies that will be covered by that. You could be a company based in the US, but again, if you have sales in Europe and other places. And it goes beyond just climate. It looks at water and biodiversity and other topics. So it goes further in a number of ways. California, they passed 2 laws last October, so October of 23, and Ceres was one of the prime sponsors of these. One, they were called SB for Senate Bill 253 and 261. While they're passed separately, they're really a package. One is requiring companies that are $1 billion or more of revenue, so not just based in California, but $1 billion more of revenue to publicly share their information in terms of the greenhouse gas protocols and their emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, which, as you know, the SEC doesn't include Scope 3. Have to talk more about it. And then the other one is really at a $500 million level, and that covers the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure, governance, risk management scenario. So combined, these cover a lot of the same elements that the SEC does, but California goes further in that they cover both public and private companies. They look at revenue size, and the estimate is there'll probably be a little more than half that are private companies.
Oh, half of private companies will need to report.
Half of the companies that are required will be private, not half of the private companies, because most companies are less than 500 million of revenue. If you're listening and you have a small company or even a medium-sized company, and you may do 50 million of revenue or 100 million, that's not a small company. You don't have requirements under California. You might under Europe, depending on what your sales are like over there.
Great. You mentioned that Ceres was a sponsor of California SB 253 and 261. Tell us what that looks like behind the scenes. What did Ceres do to help those laws come to life?
So we started advocating 3 years ago. And like a lot of things, it takes time to educate legislators and have issues and have hearings and whatever. Then the two leaders, Senator Wiener and Senator Stern, deserve enormous credit, and they and their staffs. But we brought companies and represent the company voice and the investor voice. So there were literally last September and October, companies came to Sacramento and advocated, and these are big companies, the Googles and other large companies. They went to the legislative offices and said, we've been doing this now for several years. We've been doing Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 on a voluntary basis. We think it makes sense. We think it's good from a risk perspective, and encourage companies to do that. So we help to bring the business and investor voice to these discussions.
So the SEC was late to the game. There were expectations that the rule change would arrive much earlier than it did, but in fact, it took 2 years for the change to roll out. Why did it take so long?
It's controversial. It's complex. I'm not saying anything new to say that we live in a highly polarized society on climate. There's still a small percentage of people who are still debating whether climate change is real, and if it's so, if it's human caused. And that unfortunately, Washington is very polarized. So that's number one. Number two, it's complex. While Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 gets a lot of the media attention, there are literally dozens of issues, from what size company will be covered. Do you need a third-party assurance? Does it need to be reasonable or limited assurance? Where does the information go in the financial statements, and on and on and on? And they received 24,000 comments. In the SEC's history, 91 years, they've never received so many comments. Some of them, ours included, were not like a 2-page letter. They were 50, 60, 80 pages. So there's a lot of nuance to think about. They also had to do a detailed cost-benefit analysis, and we did one of those as well. There are lots of issues. Clearly, we would have loved it to be out sooner. We appreciate what the SEC did and wish they'd gone further in terms of Scope 3 and some other things, but appreciate this as a good step. And we think it's really important to defend this. And this, we hope, will be the new floor.
So the rule change finally arrived this March. There was a lot of hope and speculation about what it might include. And when it arrived, many folks were disappointed. How come?
It didn't include everything that, for example, in the proposed rule, they talked about Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Scope 3, as your listeners know, focuses on the indirect emissions, the supply chain and other indirect emissions. While Scope 3 has been around for 20 years, companies have been filing, or not filing with the SEC, but been doing Scope 3 sometimes for up to 20 years. So it's not like a new thing. There is more complexity in Scope 3. So they took that out. There's a whole legal argument I'm happy to share if you want why they thought they should do that. They added a materiality clause, which again does not make it voluntary, as some people say. It just into the materiality. So there is reason to feel, if you start with an assumption that climate risk is financial risk and investors are asking for information, they didn't go as far as the investors wanted. We did an analysis of investor comments that clearly highlight that, and I'm happy to share that. Having said that, though, they did a lot of good things in the rule, and we hope that it gets implemented as soon as possible and moves forward, and then in the future, maybe even strengthen it. If you think about, if you're a company, between what's happening in California, what's happening in Europe and Asia, the SEC and some other efforts, there's a clear, unmistakable march towards mandatory disclosure. And while the details are different, And if you're a listener and you haven't done anything yet, I encourage you to get started today, to set up a committee, to start working on it, even if you're not covered today, because there's a growing investor demand.
Stephen, given what we heard about CSRD and the California regulation, why does it matter if Scope 3 is included in the SEC rule?
Well, because first, the SEC is a critical player internationally. They set an important tone. And there are about 76 or 7,800 companies covered by the SEC. Some of them are covered by CSRD, some are covered by California, but not all. So first, it's an important symbolic message. Second is that it sends, there are some companies that are not covered. And third is, if you just take a look at what happened with audited financials, when the SEC required decades ago, to have audited financial statements, it started with just the public companies. Today, most medium and large size private companies have to do audited statements, not because of regulators, but because the market expects it. We think that the more that Scope 3 is included, the market will expect it, even of private companies or others. So we think it is an important message. But this is like a lot of things, you start with what you have and then move forward.
For many companies, the vast majority of their emissions are Scope 3. And so I'm curious if you see this as sort of a rough draft and a first take on the rule that will eventually evolve. And will the SEC come back with a new version in a couple of years? Or will we be living with an SEC rule that just ignores where most emissions actually are coming from?
You're exactly right. Most emissions come from Scope 3, varies by sector, but most absolutely do. As we all know, elections have impacts depending what happens in the election, because in terms of the future appointees to the SEC, that will have an impact. And so I know what I personally hope, but I don't know what will happen in terms of that piece of it. But our hope is that this is a floor, that it gets implemented, and that in the not too distant future, the SEC can move forward. Let me give you an example in the insurance industry. So 4 years ago, there was not a single US insurer, not a single one, who had completed a TCFD climate disclosure, a task force for climate-related disclosure. Then the insurance regulators, it's all done at the state level, as you know, they've done insurance climate disclosure for years, but they stepped it up to include TCFD, that went a lot further. And initially, it was very controversial, but now it's not. Everyone's used to doing it, and they're on their second year of filing. It will be third year later this year. So the issue is not should they file, but what do the filings tell us? What do they say about risk management? So they've gotten beyond the political debate. And even though state insurance commissioners are in red states and blue states, so I am hopeful that a few years from now, we won't be debating the should they, but what does the information tell us? And that's really what we're hearing from around the world, Asia, Europe, and beyond, that they're tired of this debate and they want to really start to use the information in a constructive way.
Stephen, let's talk for a minute about the legal challenges that both the SEC rules and the California rules are facing. Both have been hit with lawsuits. Tell us the state of play of those suits and what do they mean for companies trying to navigate this ecosystem with the right expectations?
Absolutely. Those are critical issues. Thanks for asking that. I'll first say is I'm not a lawyer, so don't take anything that I'm saying as legal advice. Everyone should consult their own general counsel or whomever they use. But a quick summary in the SEC. So they passed their regulation on March 6th. In the next few weeks, they were sued 9 times by 7 groups who felt they went too far, oil industry and red state attorneys general and other business interests, and then 2 from other groups who feel they didn't go far enough. Those were filed in different jurisdictions around the country. Those were consolidated into one case in the 8th District, St. Louis and Minnesota and other places, 3 or 4 states in the 8th District. And now the SEC voluntarily stated, saying, let's get to the debate about the substance. So they voluntarily stated while the court has a broader discussion. The court has not released their schedule yet, but we're assuming in the next few months, they will say, here's a briefing schedule, here's a schedule for oral arguments. But again, we're waiting to see. Ceres is actually working on that. And I'd say if any of your listeners want to learn more or maybe even participate, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about that. That's on the SEC, but it will not surprise us because of the controversy of this that it goes to the Supreme Court. California was sued in the federal court district in California. The California Attorney General filed defending this and saying there were 3 claims. They thought 2 should be dispatch with right away, and the third one to be heard in court. And again, we have not heard. The California court will soon outline a schedule of that. But what we're saying to companies in both cases is you should go forward to get ready. That both are going to move forward. We think, we hope. The worst case is you've prepared this because it takes some time if you haven't done it internally, set up a committee and collect data and all of that. And even the SEC, we had a webinar a month or so ago, and there were two senior SEC officials, and they basically said the same thing. Everyone should just stay focused on getting ready, collecting data, preparing your information, because you don't want to wait and then with a month or 2 months or 6 months have to start this process. So I encourage every company, wherever they are in their process, to move it to the next level.
Stephen, I saw that Ceres is actually coordinating a sign-on letter to highlight the business community's support for full and timely implementation of SB 253 and SB 261, the California regulations. Tell us more. What is it that you're aiming to accomplish, and how's it going?
It's great. California currently has a massive budget deficit. So when the governor back in January said there were dozens of things that were passed in 2023 that required money, new money. He said, I'm not going to implement any of those yet until I know more about our budget. One of those, literally dozens and dozens of things, was a few $1 million for regulatory support to write the regulations for these two new laws. And again, a few $1 million in a budget of, I don't remember the number, but it's massive billions of dollars. California is, it's the fifth largest market in the world, is infinitesimal. And this legislation pays for itself. So in other words, once it's operational, companies file, they pay a small fee, and you add it up, and that pays for the covered cost. So it's a break even. So we are organizing a letter. So far, we have, 2 dozen, 3 dozen companies signed on to the legislature saying, these are important. We want a full implementation. We want it in a timely way. We want you to move forward. So again, if any of your listeners want to get involved with that, please reach out to me. Would love to share information and engage you in that process.
And what about the legal action against the SEC? Is Ceres getting involved somehow in rallying support or supporting one side?
We are, yes. There is a process called a friend of the court, an amicus brief. We're talking to both companies and investors about that. And again, would love to have people reach out to us. No commitment up front, just to learn more information and to engage. What is clear in both the SEC and California is that companies' voices, investor voices matters a lot.
Stephen, I'd like to zoom out for a second and talk about one of the potential downsides of reporting requirements. I spend a lot of time with chief sustainability officers who are deeply committed to climate progress, and yet reporting isn't always popular as reporting has taken over their jobs. Many CSOs complain that it's hard to take on more ambitious projects because so much of their time is now focused on reporting. So what do you think about this challenge of balancing reporting with actually doing the work?
We actually contracted maybe 2 years ago now an economic study of what are people spending now and what would it cost. So the average large company of the survey that was done is spending $533,000 to collect information. So $500,000. The average large investment firm, an institutional investor, is spending $1.3 million. And part of the reason to collect this is that there's so many different methodologies. There's a whole alphabet soup of acronyms. Every group collecting information for CDP and SBTI and TCFD and ISSB and CSRD, and the list goes on and on and on. They're all good individually, but they all measure a little differently. And the more that you can have consistency and have what's called substituted compliance, meaning if you file it in one, if it's similar, you can use it in another. And so we believe, and if you look at other things over the history of our country, including audited financial statements, that if you have a regulatory system and they require the same methodology, be filed in the same place, that I don't want to say costs are going to come down dramatically, but you can get better information, maybe for the same cost, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. I mean, imagine, for example, if we didn't have an audited financial and company A filed an income statement and company B filed a balance sheet and company C did a sources and uses, and then D did it in Chinese and fourth did it in German, you wouldn't be able to compare them. And you spend all this time trying to figure it out. And well, that's where we are now in climate issues. There's a lot of good information, but but it's not consistent. So I completely agree with the chief sustainability officers that say collecting the data is getting in the way. As more companies do it, it's going to become more routine. The cost to collect a certain piece of data will come down because, again, you're getting more volume, that the learning curve, there are more folks within companies and consultants out there now. So they're exactly right. And we think the regulatory process will help to standardize it. It's not going to all happen overnight, but we think compared to like 5 years ago, we had so much less information. 5 years from now, we think there'll be more information and it'll be more consistent and less burdensome.
And in terms of the actual influence of reporting on investor behavior, we know that the last year or so, there's been backlash to ESG. Is there still evidence that doing this reporting is actually going to reward the companies that are taking the right sort of action in terms of climate progress?
Sure. So companies that make bold statements and then don't back them up, that has been counterproductive for them. But companies that make very specific statements, we reduced our water use by blank, we reduced carbon emission by blank, and we did it for a business reason. It's not they did it for a political reason, that it makes business sense. Those have continued to be rewarded. What we found is that there is a lot of pushback on what's been said, but it's not, and I'm using broad generalizations now, but companies are still taking bold action. They are still preparing for this. And the reality is, while there is pushback on the politics, Mother Nature is also continuing to move forward. I mean, just one little factoid, in the 1980s, NOAA identified that there was $1 billion storm every 4 months. Last year is every 2.5 to 3 weeks. If you're a company, and whether you're a facility, your employees, your suppliers, the chance of being in the line of a fire, flood, tornado, heat is going up dramatically. The insurance industry is facing enormous risks right now. They're literally stopping to insure millions of people, and others, they're increasing rates very dramatically. So these are real risks. Companies understand that. They are working to address those. Again, not for a political reason, but because it makes good fiduciary and business sense.
Stephen, you were talking about companies making big statements and having trouble keeping up with them. And another thing I've been hearing from CSOs, really in private spaces, is the difficulty, or some say near impossibility, of achieving their emissions targets. Is Ceres working on something that'll help companies not just become more accountable, but also make it easier or more likely that they'll achieve the goals they set?
Yes, it's a very important issue. And to address this, we need all of us to work together. It means the government, private sector, community groups, advocates, academics, everyone, because the problem we're in is a problem building over years as part of that. They say you should, what's the expression? You should shoot for the stars, and if not, you may at least hit the moon. We think it's important for the companies to be realistic but ambitious. It's also very important not just to set a 2050 goal, because the average CEO of Fortune 500 company lasts less than 7 years. So the idea of setting a goal that maybe 3 or 4 CEOs later, but is to set interim goals. So where do you want to be by 2030, by 2035, 2040? And for a big company, the decisions today will affect absolutely where you'll be in 2030. So our hope is that as a world, as a country and companies, that we've reduced emissions by 50% by 2030. We're not on track to do that now. So we have to work harder at it. And it's both reducing the risk and increasing the opportunity. The world is spending about $1.9 trillion last year on new, renewable, emerging technologies and variety of things. So just under 2 trillion. That's projected by the UN that needs to be 4 trillion. Those are some big numbers, but it's also opportunities for people to make money. So a lot of your listeners work for companies. It's not just a risk to do it. It's an opportunity to make money selling more products or services or reducing their water use that will cost more money. So yes, it is complicated. We think everyone needs to work at it. We have a number of tools we work with companies and investors on. And even if they don't get exactly the goal, to strive as hard as they can, we're also finding that it creates leadership opportunities, that employees, customers, and others are voting with their pocketbook on companies that are leading this effort.
Stephen, what's next? The SEC rule change was a major milestone and something that you worked on for years. What else do you have in the works, and what else needs to happen to accelerate positive change in capital markets?
Well, if you think that the SEC is really disclosure, disclosure doesn't decarbonize. It just shares more information. So the next step is, and many companies are already doing this, we think that every medium and large size company and every medium and large size investor should have a transition plan. It's now 2024. If I'm a company, here's our emissions for these various product lines or sources or suppliers. Where do I want to be in 2030? Am I engaging my suppliers now? Have I set short-term goals? And every industry is different. We talk to companies every day about this. So we hope that every company, again, medium, large size company, medium, large size investor, has a transition plan that they put in place. And then as part of that, they just continue their effort to decarbonize, look at their water usage, looking at biodiversity, looking at a variety of these topics. Also, it's important to minimize their risk. It's important from an upside of, again, business opportunities. It's important because of customer employee loyalty. And there are some great examples of leadership who have these transition plans. There are some countries, UK, for example, is starting to require them, these transition plans. The United States Department of Treasury, they issued a net zero transition plan guidance for the financial sector. So that is very important. But I also don't want to skip over all the disclosure. Once the information's out there, then analyze the information and looking at what that's telling us, as we're starting to do with the insurance industry.
Stephen, as you mentioned before, elections matter. And the US, of course, is in the midst of a big election year. What's at stake? I know that Ceres is a nonprofit, and as a nonpartisan organization, you won't be in a position to endorse a particular candidate. But tell us in a broad sense, how will the election influence climate progress?
Exactly. So we are nonpartisan. We work with folks of every party, unenrolled, but at every level, whether that be a state representative, a mayor, a state treasurer, a member of Congress, senator, and who's ever in the White House, elections matter. And there's a lot of things that you can do in whatever the role. I'll just start with the White House, for example. Your appointees to various agencies, the regulations you push through, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was really a partnership with Congress and the White House. It's the largest single investment in the history of our country in climate strategies. But there are important bills every day in state capitals across the country, regulations from a variety of regulatory agencies at the federal and state level, officials from state treasurers and attorneys general make impact all the time. So we are not involved with elections, but understand they have an impact, and it is the White House, but it's not just the White House. And we encourage everybody who's listening to decide what candidates you support and help support them.
Stephen, what else can people do? We have listeners that are on sustainability teams at large companies. We have investors, entrepreneurs, activists. What should our listeners be doing?
So first is to continue what they're doing. Don't be afraid. Don't feel, it's too big of a burden or we're not making progress. We're making enormous progress, but we're also facing enormous challenges. So continue what you're doing. And then in your sphere of influence, what's the next step? If you think about a ladder, what would be the next step in the ladder? Like if you're on a committee and maybe your company's measuring scope 1, scope 2, start a scope 3 process and begin that process. If you're not speaking out, can you get the support to speak out? If you're an investor, how much have you worked with all of your portfolio companies to encourage them to set a net zero plan? How much are you talking with your folks in your industry at conferences and things like that about doing this? So it is both doing the work, but it affects everything you do. It affects, for an operating company, your supply chain, your vendors, where you open factories, if you have factories or offices. When you're recruiting your board, is there somebody who has information? We, for example, have a course, an online course with University of Michigan, and there are other courses too. Are you finding ways to inform and train your board and other senior folks to address these issues? If you're in the very senior management, And if you have an incentive compensation plan, are these issues part of it? We're not saying they should be all or even most, but is this part of this? So in everything you're doing, from the HR practices to the customer practices to the advertising and marketing, supply, board of directors, and so much more, there's opportunities to move this ball forward.
Stephen, a final question. As I think about my work running accelerator programs with companies and other folks that are in that industry, you get a sense of graduation, a sense of completion as companies hit a milestone, as they're able to go raise funding or move on to the next stage. But you're accelerating our capital markets. What is that for you? Do you get a sense of graduation, or when is your job done?
I don't think my job is done, but absolutely there's enormous satisfaction. Again, if you look at 5 years ago, there was not a single institutional investor, not a single one in the United States, that had set a net zero plan. Today, it's investors representing tens of trillions of dollars. Not a single insurer had filed climate disclosure plans. Now, over 80% of them have. There was not a single law that required this. Things like the Inflation Reduction Act, and the list goes on and on. And fundamentally, there are so many companies that are doing so many examples of great leadership. But this problem of the climate risk has been going on for decades. And so it's not easy to solve. Journalist and writer H.L. Mencken once said, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer that's always wrong. So this is multifaceted, but I am an incurable optimist. But I've seen many, many, many examples of leadership here. So our hope is that companies, if they weren't doing disclosure, are doing disclosure. If they've done disclosure, working on net zero plans, working on implementing. And I've seen some amazing things every day from companies that are highlighting their work to decarbonize, to look at water usage, to look at biodiversity and other things. We just need to do more, and we need to do it a lot faster.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time today and for all the work that you're doing, and congratulations on all the progress.
Thank you, and thank you for the important work you're doing and for helping to get the word out. There's nothing more important than sharing this, and appreciate, again, all of your listeners for what you're doing. And if there are ways we can partner with Ceres, or you want to help us in the advocacy, please reach out to Ceres. We'd love to talk to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.